There are secrets that families keep for decades. Secrets that sit quietly in the background of every photograph, every celebration, every ordinary moment. Secrets that the people who carry them learn to live with, so completely that the carrying becomes invisible. And then one day, the secret comes out, and everything you thought you knew about a person shifts. Not dramatically, not violently, but permanently. Because you understand now that the face they showed the world was only part of the story, and the part they kept hidden was the part that made them who they really were. This is the story of Anni-Frid Lyngstad, and this is the story nobody told you. Before we go any further, imagine this. You are 4 years old. You live with your grandmother in a small town in Norway. Your mother is gone. She died when you were very young, and you were too small to fully understand what that means. Your father, you have been told, does not exist. Or rather, you have been told nothing at all. Because the truth about your father is something the adults around you have decided, for reasons you cannot yet understand, to keep from you entirely. You grow up with this absence, this unnamed space where a father should be. And you learn, the way children learn these things, not to ask, because asking causes pain, and you are already carrying enough. Anni-Frid Lyngstad was born on November 15th, 1945, in Bjørkåsen, Norway. Her mother was Anni Lyngstad. Her father, according to everything she was told as a child, was unknown. What she was not told, what nobody told her for decades, was that her father was a German soldier, a man named Alfred Haase, a man who had been stationed in Norway during the German occupation of World War II, a man who had fallen in love with her mother, and then, when the war ended, had returned to Germany, without knowing that Anni was pregnant, without knowing that he had a daughter. This was not an unusual story in post-war Norway. Thousands of Norwegian women had relationships with German soldiers during the occupation. And when the war ended, those women and their children faced something brutal. They were called names. They were ostracized. They were treated as collaborators, as traitors, as people who had chosen the wrong side. The children, who had chosen nothing, who were simply born, were called Tyskerunge, German brats, and they were made to feel the shame of their origins every single day. Anni Lyngstad could not protect her daughter from this. She could barely protect herself. So she made a decision, the kind of decision that desperate people make when the options are limited and the stakes are everything. She took Anni-Frid to her mother, to grandmother Arntine, and she left Norway for Germany. She was trying to find Alfred, trying to build something, trying to give her daughter a future that wasn't poisoned by the war her daughter had had nothing to do with. Anni died in Germany in 1947. Anni-Frid was 2 years old. She never knew her mother. Grandmother Arntine raised Anni-Frid in Torshälla, Sweden. They had moved there from Norway, away from the shame, away from the whispers, away from the word Tyskerunge that followed children like Anni-Frid wherever they went. Sweden was a fresh start, a place where nobody knew the story, a place where a little girl with an extraordinary voice could simply be a little girl with an extraordinary voice. And the voice was there from the beginning. Everyone who knew Anni-Frid as a child speaks about it the same way, with a kind of wonder, as if they are still surprised by it even decades later. It was not just that she could sing, it was the quality of what came out when she sang. A depth, a weight, something that seemed to come from further down than technique or training or even natural talent, something that seemed to come from the specific gravity of her particular life. She began performing professionally as a teenager. She joined a band. She recorded. She worked. She built a career with the determination of someone who has learned early that nothing comes without effort, and that effort is the only thing you can fully control. By the time ABBA formed, by the time Eurovision happened and everything changed, Anni-Frid was already a seasoned professional, already someone who knew how to be on a stage, already someone who understood, instinctively, that performance is not about showing people who you are, it is about giving them something they need. But underneath all of that, underneath the performances and the professionalism and the extraordinary voice and the ABBA fame that would eventually make her one of the most recognised people on the planet, there was still that 4-year-old girl, the one who had grown up without a mother, without a father, with a name she couldn't fully claim and an origin she had been taught to hide. She knew her father was German. She had been told this much, but she did not know who he was, did not know his name, did not know if he was alive, did not know if he had ever thought about her in all the years between. And for most of her life, she did not ask, because asking meant opening something. And opening things, when you have spent your whole life learning to keep them closed, is the most frightening thing in the world. The ABBA years came and went, the fame, the music, the marriage to Benny, the divorce from Benny, the extraordinary global phenomenon of two people who had loved each other, making some of the most celebrated music of the century, and then quietly going their separate ways. Anni-Frid handled it the way she handled everything, with a composure that looked effortless from the outside, and cost everything on the inside. After ABBA dissolved, she moved to Switzerland. She had married Prince Heinrich Rutzow-Reuss von Plauen in 1992, a German prince, which is its own particular irony, given what she was about to discover. They had a quiet life, a private life, the kind of life that Anni-Frid had always wanted and never quite managed to have during the ABBA years. And then, in 1977, wait, the discovery happened later, but the search, the private internal search, had been going on for much longer. Anni-Frid had begun asking questions, carefully, quietly, the way she did everything. She had started to piece together what she knew, and what she suspected, and what she needed to find out before it was too late. The moment of discovery came in 1977. A German magazine ran a story. The story mentioned Anni-Frid Lyngstad. It mentioned her origins. It mentioned a German soldier named Alfred Haase, who had been stationed in Norway during the war. And somewhere in Germany, an old man read that story, and recognized the name of a woman he had loved, and understood, for the first time, that he had a daughter. Alfred Haase contacted Anni-Frid. The details of that first contact have never been fully reported, but those who know Anni-Frid say that it was one of the most significant moments of her life. Not because it was joyful, although there was joy in it. Not because it was painful, although there was pain in it too. But because it was true. It was the truth about where she came from, the truth she had been carrying the absence of for 32 years. She met her father. They built a relationship. Not a simple one, nothing about this story was simple, but a real one. A relationship between two people who had been separated by a war neither of them had chosen, and who found each other across decades of silence and tried to make something of what remained. Think about what Anni-Frid carried into that meeting. Not just 32 years of not knowing, but 32 years of being the child of a secret, of growing up in the shadow of a war that had ended before she could walk, of being Tiskerunge, German brat, in a country that had suffered under German occupation, of having an identity built partly on an absence that was now, finally, filled. Alfred Haase died in 1983, just a few years after they found each other. Not enough time. Never enough time. But something. A beginning. An acknowledgement. A truth that had been hidden for decades, finally spoken out loud. Anni-Frid has spoken about her father rarely and carefully over the years. She has said that meeting him gave her something she had not known she was missing. Not a father, it was too late for that, but a history, an understanding of where she came from, a sense of herself as part of a story that was larger than the one she had been given. And here is what strikes you when you know this story, and then you listen to Anni-Frid sing. The weight in her voice, the particular quality of depth that everyone who heard her noticed from the beginning. It was not just talent. It was not just training. It was the specific gravity of a life that had started in loss, and continued in searching, and arrived, eventually, at something like truth. Her voice carried all of that, every time, in every studio, on every stage, in every ABBA recording that has outlasted the decade it was made in. That voice was never just a voice. It was a history, a secret finally told. A woman who had grown up without a past, singing her way into a permanent one. The years after ABBA were not easy for Anni-Frid. They rarely are for people who have lived at that particular altitude of fame. The descent is its own kind of disorientation. You spend years being one of the most recognised people on the planet, and then one day you are simply a person, walking through the world like everyone else, unrecognised, unobserved, free in a way you had forgotten was possible, and terrifying in a way you had not anticipated. She moved to Switzerland. She made solo music. She was involved in environmental causes. She became a serious and committed advocate for environmental protection, founding her own organisation and working with genuine dedication on issues that mattered to her deeply. This was not the behaviour of someone coasting on past fame. This was someone building a life with purpose. Someone who had always been more than the sequined costumes, and was finally, quietly, proving it. Her husband, Prince Heinrich, died in 1999. Cancer. He was 49 years old. Anni-Frid was 53. The grief was enormous, and private, in the way that Anni-Frid's deepest experiences have always been private. She did not perform it for the world. She carried it the way she had always carried the difficult things, inward, carefully, with a composure that cost everything and showed nothing. But here is what you need to understand about Anni-Frid Lyngstad. The composure was never indifference. It was never distance. It was the most sophisticated form of presence, the ability to feel everything and choose what to do with it, to give the world what it needed through the music, and to keep the rest for herself. This is not a common quality. It is perhaps the rarest quality that exists in a performer, and Anni-Frid had it in abundance. Wait, don't miss this detail. In the years after ABBA, while the world was rediscovering the music through Mamma Mia and compilation albums and film adaptations, Anni-Frid was living her life in Switzerland, quietly, privately, occasionally emerging for an interview or a charitable event, never chasing the spotlight, never trying to capitalise on the nostalgia, simply living, as if she had made a decision long ago that fame was something that had happened to her, not something she was, and that the person she was worth protecting. When the voyage conversations began, when Benny and Bjorn reached out, Anni-Frid's response was characteristically careful. She did not say yes immediately. She thought about it. She considered what it would mean. She asked the questions that only someone who has lived through extraordinary fame and walked away from it on her own terms would think to ask. Not, what will this do for my career? But, what will this cost me? And is it worth it? She decided it was, and she walked back into a studio in Stockholm for the first time in nearly 40 years, and she sang. The recordings from Voyage reveal something extraordinary about Anni-Frid's voice at 75. It has changed. Of course it has changed. The high notes that came effortlessly in 1976 require more care in 2021. The range has shifted. The timbre has deepened. But something else has happened too. Something that only time can do to a voice that was always built on more than technique. The weight has deepened. The truth in it has become more concentrated. As if 75 years of living, of secrets and discoveries and losses and loves and grief and survival have distilled themselves into something purer than what was there before. When I Still Have Faith in You was released, and people heard Anni-Frid's voice for the first time in decades, something happened that the music industry struggles to quantify. People stopped, in the middle of whatever they were doing, and listened. Not because the song was familiar, it was new. Not because of nostalgia, although there was nostalgia, but because that voice, that particular, unrepeatable, deeply human voice, was still telling the truth, still carrying what it had always carried, still giving the world something it had not known it needed until it heard it. This is what Anni-Frid Lyngstad has always done. From the 4-year-old girl in Torshälla who sang before she could fully read, to the teenager who performed in Norwegian dance halls, to the ABBA member who stood on the world's biggest stages and made everything look effortless, to the woman in her 70s who walked back into a studio and reminded the world why some voices cannot be replaced. She has carried a secret her whole life, the secret of where she came from, the secret of what it cost to be who she was, the secret of the weight inside the voice. And she has given that secret, every time she sang, to anyone who was willing to listen. The stage lights may have gone out, but that voice, that particular, irreplaceable, truth-telling voice, is still ringing. And somewhere in Switzerland, a woman who grew up without a past and built one note by note knows exactly what that means. And it is enough.